John Drain wrote a book called The McDonaldization of the Church years ago. And he encouraged you to do this experiment in the book. He said, ask someone, rather than ask them what they do when you meet them, ask them to describe themselves. Now, this is in the early 2000s that I read the book, and I've tried to do that ever since then, instead of saying, what do you do? And it is fascinating. People automatically do that. But he said, I've done this exercise for years. I've only found one man who actually defined himself by his relationships. He said, I'm a husband, I'm a father, and he went through all of that. But for many of us now, I think it's infinitely more even complicated. It's not about just necessarily what you do, it's what you're into, what's your tribe of thought. I mean, we have so many infinite subgroups that we can identify with, which is really a crushing burden. And we think this illusion that we're cut off from our family. Your family is not what you're born into, it's what you choose. And we have all these alternative definitions of family. And I think part of the reason is we forgot that we are creatures, that we are beholden. But why is that so, in some ways, revolting to the modern mind today, that you are a creature and you have limitations?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I think we're just pretty inconsistent on this. In some ways,
Yeah.
like we love some of the psychological studies, and because of some Templeton work I've done in the last decade, I work with Christian psychologists on various things, which has been really helpful and interesting. And in some ways, I do think there's like just culturally a real interest in psychology, which often includes looking at family heritage, connections, physiological kind of things. In some ways, our challenge is we are interested in our biology, right? Where we'll say, well, this gets passed on and this gets passed on. And so it's not your, and yet in other ways, we're like, no, you get to define yourself. And I think we jump between those and are not comfortable with either. But when in social circumstances or in kind of media, that what we really emphasize by and large is you get to create your own identity, and it's just whatever you say it is. And Dietrich Bonhoeffer, when he was in his early 20s, in the early part of the 20th century, when he was first doing pastoral ministry, he was in Spain. So he was early 20s ministering, by and large. Part of the congregation were these young high school students and stuff, and college students. And he's talking about this very idea, and he's like, the problem is my inside world is completely chaotic. And so this is where I think this is feeding our problem, because you look in and go, you know what, I am this, I feel this way, I think, and then the next day you're like, I don't know. And so it's very unstable, right? And Bonhoeffer, years and years later, has a poem he writes when he's in prison, where he's there because he's accused of being involved in the plot to kill Hitler. And he has this poem where it's called Who Am I? And part of the back and forth, as you may remember in that poem, is this idea of, others, including the guards and others, they look at me and they think I'm under control and they see me in this certain kind of way, but I know I'm deeply scared, and I move between self-righteousness and condemnation and all this kind of stuff. And in the end of the poem, which I think is very beautiful and powerful, he says, who am I? He's like, I don't know, but God knows. And that's enough. And that's a very powerful word in our day, because whether it's we're trying to get our identity by looking inside and we just decide, or by looking at other people and they get to tell us who we are, those are both in their own way kind of problematic. There is something about, no, God knows who we are. God takes our internal and external worlds into account. He's the only one who makes this perfect judgment. But I just, that's a meandering way of me saying, I really think these are very difficult issues in our day, because in some ways we're all about our bodies, and in other ways we pretend that our bodies don't matter at all. In some ways we act like relationships deeply matter, and in other ways we're like, no, you get to decide these things on your own. So, and the last thing I would just say there is, Matt Voss is a good friend of mine who's a sociologist. And I mentioned this in the book, one of the exercises he does at the very beginning of an intro to sociology class, and you kind of alluded to this kind of thing earlier, he'll have a student come up and he'll say, tell me about yourself. And then he'll give this qualification. Good. Tell us who you are. Tell us about yourself, but you cannot use any any reference to a relationship. And people will say, well, I'm a soccer player. Like, well, actually, to be a soccer player, you're part of a team. That's so that doesn't work. Or anyways, and they actually can't do it. And then when he allows someone to come up and say, now tell us about yourself, but freely use relationship. Well, I'm from this family, or I love this sport. I love this band. All of these things that are connected are important. So all that to say, the self is quite complicated. We need to honor that. But I think a Christian approach allows us to take the internal and external worlds seriously, but all in light of looking to God, who's the one who affirms who we are, rather than being dependent on a shaky internal or external world.